There is a question that still makes the older residents of Harwick County pause when they hear it, and it is this. Why would a woman spend 3 full winters dragging other people's cast-off dairy equipment through frozen mud, hauling it home on a borrowed flatbed, stacking it in a barn? Everyone agreed was already half a ruin, paying good money for metal that the men at the co-op said was not worth the scrap price, and doing all of it alone, except for a one-eyed border collie who watched her with an attention that bordered on devotion. The people who laughed have had decades to consider the answer. Most of them still cannot say it plainly. But the answer was there the whole time, encoded in the rusted flanges and pitted copper sleeves and cracked rubber gaskets she carried home like trophies, and in the small leather notebook she kept in her breast pocket, and in the single sentence her grandmother had written on the first page in a hand that slanted left as if leaning into wind. The sentence read, "Metal holds memory, and a patient hand can read it." That is where the story begins. Her name was Constance Vane, and in the autumn of 1951, she was 43 years old, recently widowed, the owner of 11 acres outside the town of Harwick, and the object of a sympathy so dense and well-intentioned that it functioned like a wall. Her husband, Gerald, had died in July, a quiet man who kept precise records and whose absence left the farm not ruined but diminished, as though the place had exhaled and not yet decided whether to breathe again. Constance had no children. She had a barn, the collie, a chest of Gerald's field notebooks going back to 1931, and a grandmother's small leather volume that had traveled from a dairy region 2 states east, where the woman had spent 40 years observing with scientific patience the behavior of raw milk under varying conditions of temperature, container surface, airflow, and time. Nobody in Harwick knew this. Nobody had thought to ask. What they saw was a widow doing strange things. In October, she drove the flatbed to the Pruitt farm sale and came home with 6 cream cans so corroded the auctioneer had bundled them as a lot for $2.60. She stacked them against the barn's south wall. The collie walked among them, nose tipped to the metal, and seemed satisfied. In November, she drove to 2 more dispersal sales and returned with a milk separator so old the brand name had corroded off the drum, a collection of shallow tin trays with hairline fractures along the rolled edges, and 3 copper-lined cooler tanks that had not been used since before the war, possibly since before the previous war. She paid $11 total. She stacked these, too. And then she spent the first of many evenings sitting on an overturned bucket under a lantern reading her grandmother's notebook with the focused attention of a student preparing for an examination she expected to be difficult. The notebook was not a recipe. It was a record of failures, observations, and conclusions accumulated over decades of watching raw milk behave. Her grandmother had noticed that certain container surfaces produced consistent results, that copper of a specific thickness and age had a particular relationship with the natural cultures present in fresh milk, that temperature curves mattered more than temperature points, that the shallow tin trays, when they were the right tin of the right gauge, held a cold that descended evenly from every surface at once rather than pooling at the bottom the way glass and ceramic did. The notebook held numbers. It held dates. It held the grandmother's quiet frustration with neighbors who had switched to newer equipment because the salesman's pamphlets said newer was cleaner, and her observation, stated plainly in that leftward slanting hand, that what the pamphlets called clean was often only empty, stripped of the cultures that had always made the milk into something more than milk. The sentence at the end of the entry for March of 1919 read, "They are in such a hurry to improve on what they do not yet understand." Constance read that sentence and then looked at the corroded cream cans stacked against the wall and felt something she would later describe to her only confidant as recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. The man who arrived to express the community's concern was named Harold Fetzer, and he was the county extension agent, a position he occupied with the serene certainty of a man who has never been wrong about anything important. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, and accustomed to being thanked. He drove to Constance's farm on a Tuesday in December of 1951 and found her on her knees in the barn with a wire brush and a tin of cleaning compound, working the interior of a copper-lined cooler tank with the slow, circular patience of someone polishing a lens. The collie watched him from beside the stacked cream cans with its one good eye and did not move. Fetzer walked around the equipment for a while, the way men do when they are constructing a verdict. He picked up one of the cream cans and turned it over and set it down. He said he had heard she was buying up old dairy equipment at the sales. She said she was. He said he wanted her to understand kindly that the new stainless steel equipment the co-op was supplying on credit terms was the sanitary standard now. That the state health inspector was not going to approve raw milk sales from anything that did not meet the current code, that copper-lined equipment of the pre-war variety had been specifically deprecated in the most recent guidance, and that he was only telling her this as a neighbor and a friend, not as an agent of any authority, and that he would hate to see her spend her grief money, if he could call it that, on metal that the state would never certify. He said the word grief the way people say it when they want you to know they are being tender with you. Constance set down the wire brush. She said, "I know what I am doing, Harold." He nodded with the patient sorrow of a man who has heard this before. He said he would leave her his card in case she wanted to talk through the co-op credit application. She thanked him. He drove away. She picked up the wire brush and went back to work. The collie moved to a position nearer to the copper tank, lay down, and put its chin on its forepaws. It was Gerald's notebooks that contained the second layer of the plan. Gerald had kept meticulous records not of farming in general, but of one specific phenomenon he had observed across 20 years of watching Harwick County's weather. He had been, in his quiet way, obsessed with the aquifer that ran beneath the eastern slope of the county, a deep limestone formation that surfaced in 3 places as reliable springs, one of which emerged on the lower corner of their 11 acres. Gerald had noted the spring's output by volume and temperature across every month of every year from 1931 to the month before he died. He had noted correlations patiently between drought years in the broader region and the spring's behavior. He had noted in 1946 that the spring's temperature held within 2 degrees of 51 Fahrenheit across every season, including the worst of the recorded droughts, because it was fed not by surface water, but by the deep limestone reserve that the surface years could not reach. He had written, in his more careful handwriting than hers, a single underlined observation. "This water does not know what season it is." Then, in a later entry from 1949, he had written something she had not noticed until after he died, when she went back through all the notebooks. "If the surface ever fails, this is the thing that will not fail." She had read that sentence sitting on the edge of the bed they had shared, in the August heat 3 weeks after the funeral, and she had understood that he had been trying to tell her something across the years, not about grief, but about water. The plan, when she had assembled it from the grandmother's notebook and Gerald's records, was simple in its structure and complicated only in its execution. She intended to use the spring-fed, constant-temperature water as the cold medium for a raw milk aging operation run through the old copper-lined equipment, working with the natural cultures that the copper surfaces had accumulated over decades of use rather than against them. The specific temperature of the spring water fell within a narrow band that her grandmother had documented as optimal for a particular class of traditional cultured cream products that required no refrigeration equipment, no electric compressors, no co-op infrastructure, and no stainless steel. The products her grandmother had described were not fashionable. They were not modern. They were the kind of thing that serious food people in the cities had not yet rediscovered, and the kind of thing that the older farm wives in Harwick County remembered from their childhoods and had assumed were simply gone. Constance had no plan to sell to the cities. She had a plan to sell to the farm wives. She spent the winter of 51 into 52 restoring the equipment. She worked by lantern light on the coldest nights and by the thin gray daylight on the rest. She relined the gaskets herself, sourcing the materials through a specialty supplier 2 states away who seemed surprised to have a customer and sent along without being asked. a 4-page mimeographed guide to the proper calibration of pre-war copper cooler fittings that read as though it had been written by someone who assumed the reader already knew what they were doing. She filed this with Gerald's notebooks and her grandmother's volume. She dug a channel from the spring to the barn using a spade and a determination that left her hands so calloused she could rest her palms on the wire brush without feeling it. She lined the channel with flat limestone slabs she gathered from the creek bed, fitted them by hand without mortar, and allowed the spring water to flow at its constant 51 degrees through the barn's lower level where the cooler tanks sat. She did this over 8 months. She told no one the whole of it. She answered questions with facts. The spring of '52 brought 2 more visitors to the barn. The first was Maureen Hopple, who was the wife of the Methodist minister and who came with a covered dish of something warm and a face full of the specific worry that kind women aim at widows who are not behaving correctly. Maureen stood in the barn doorway looking at the copper equipment glowing under Constance's restoration and said she hoped Constance was not overextending herself, that she had heard about the equipment purchases, and that the ladies' circle would be very happy to help with whatever financial pressures the estate might have left, because nobody would think anything of it, because they all thought so much of Gerald and of her. She said the words financial pressures the way Fetzer had said grief, tenderly, like a diagnosis. Constance said, "I am not in financial pressure, Maureen. Thank you for the dish." The second visitor was a man named Aldous Price, who owned 400 acres to the north and whose grandfather had built the county's first commercial dairy. He came not with a covered dish, but with an expression of open, cheerful condescension that he had presumably been perfecting since birth. He walked through the barn uninvited, looked at the limestone-lined channel and the cooler tanks and the cream cans Constance had been cleaning for 6 months and said, "Connie, this is the damnedest museum I have ever seen." Then he laughed, and it was not a cruel laugh, but a delighted one, which was somehow more final. He said his operation had gone fully to refrigerated stainless the previous year, and it was the best business decision he had ever made. He said if she wanted to understand what modern dairy economics looked like, she should come by sometime and he would be happy to show her. He said it the way people say it when they know you will not come. She did not go. She went back to fitting the copper lids to the cooler tanks. The one who saw it differently arrived in June of '52 on foot, which was unusual. She was a woman named Ruth Calder, who lived on 3 acres at the county's eastern edge and kept 2 cows and a determined silence about her own business. Ruth had grown up on her family's farm in a region where the old cultured cream traditions had persisted later than in Harwick County, and when she walked into the barn and saw the copper equipment and the limestone channel and the collie watching from beside the spring outlet, she stood still for a moment and then turned to Constance and said, "Who taught you this?" Constance said, "My grandmother, and Gerald told me about the water." Ruth looked at the channel again. She said, "The water is the part nobody ever got right." That was the whole of the conversation that mattered. Ruth began coming 3 mornings a week. They worked without talking much and talked a little when they rested. Ruth had a practiced hand with the separator, something Constance was still learning, and in exchange, Constance taught her to read the notebook's temperature notations and understand what the numbers were measuring. They developed a working method that was efficient and quiet and that the collie approved of, which they both treated as meaningful. By late summer of '52, the first batches were ready. The cultured cream products that emerged from the copper cooler tanks were not identical to anything either woman could buy in a store. They were richer and more complex and had a depth of flavor that Ruth, who had eaten the real article as a child, said was right. Constance made notes. She adjusted the timing. She made more notes. The second batch was better. The third was the thing her grandmother had described in the notebook's most precise entry, the one dated 1922, where the old woman had written the temperature and the timing and the copper gauge, and then, at the bottom in a different pen, as if she had come back to it later, had added, "When it is exactly right, it does not taste like it was made. It tastes like it was found." They sold the first jars quietly to 6 farm wives in the autumn of '52. They asked no advertising. The farm wives said what they said to one another, and by December there were 11 regular customers. By the spring of '53, there were 23. The price was modest. The jars came back clean. Nobody complained. Harold Fetzer heard about it through the ordinary channels by which Harold Fetzer heard about things, which was to say that his wife told him, having heard from a neighbor, having heard from a farm wife, who had managed to keep it quiet for a remarkably long time given how good it was. He drove to the farm in April of '53 with a different expression on his face than the one he had worn the previous December. He was still carrying the same certainty, but it had developed a hairline fracture somewhere and he was holding it more carefully. He walked through the barn. He looked at the state certification placard on the wall, which Constance had obtained after an inspection that had required 3 letters from a specialist she had located through the mimeographed guide and a detailed submission of her grandmother's documentation and Gerald's water temperature records translated into the language the inspector recognized. He looked at the placard for a while. He said, "How did you get that past Delmar?" She said, "I showed him the numbers." He looked at the channel and the copper tanks and the cream cans on their shelves, each one labeled in Constance's handwriting with a date and a batch number. He was a man trying to understand how a thing he had confidently dismissed had become a certified fact. The processing of this took visible effort. He said, "The copper is not deprecated for this category of product." She said, "No, it is not." He said he had not been aware of the distinction. She said she knew. He said, with the halting syntax of a man paying a debt he has not budgeted for, that the work she had done here was more thorough than he had expected. She thanked him. He nodded and drove away, and she understood that this was as close as Harold Fetzer would come to the words he actually owed her, and she did not need him to come closer. She was 45 years old, and she had learned what she was doing, and the learning was its own reward, and his acknowledgement or the lack of it did not change the temperature of the spring water. The summer of '53 was dry. Not ruinously dry, not yet, but the kind of dry that makes farmers look at the sky with an attention that feels like prayer and plant their next year's decisions in whatever they conclude. Aldous Price's refrigeration compressors ran at capacity, and his electricity bill for July was the highest it had been since he installed the system, which he mentioned at the co-op in a tone that suggested expense and modernness were the same virtue. His milk output was fine. His operation was fine. He was not concerned. The summer of '54 was different. It began dry in April and stayed dry in a way that had a quality of decision about it, as though the sky had made up its mind. By June, the creek that fed the county's smaller farms was running at half its usual level. By July, it was a series of standing pools connected by a trickle that smelled of warm clay. The wells on the lighter soil properties to the west began dropping in August. The co-op's milk intake fell because cows on farms without adequate water drank less and produced less, and the math was simple and terrible. Aldous Price's refrigeration system required water for its cooling circuit. He had known this in the abstract, the way people know things they have not needed to test. His pond dropped in July. His cooling circuit began running hot in August, and the compressors began cycling in a manner the technician said was not ideal. The technician came twice in August and once in early September, and each time said something was not ideal and each time left a bill. On the 14th of September, the primary compressor seized. The milk already in the tanks soured before the backup was operational. It was $2,200 of product in 6 hours, and it was the kind of loss that does not destroy a 400-acre operation, but that leaves a mark that does not go away. Constance heard about it on the 15th. She was in the barn filling the morning's batch of jars. The spring had run at 51 degrees every day of the drought without exception because it was fed by the deep limestone reserve that the surface years could not reach, which was exactly what Gerald had written down in 1949 in his careful handwriting. The collie was asleep in the corner by the channel, one ear moving occasionally as the water made its small sounds over the limestone slabs. She set down the jar she was filling. She looked at the spring outlet for a moment. She said to Ruth, who was working the separator, "He lost the tank." Ruth said, "How bad?" Constance said, "Bad enough." Ruth said nothing further. They worked the rest of the morning in the silence they had learned to be comfortable in. Price came the next day. He drove up in the truck and did not get out for a moment, which was unusual for a man accustomed to arriving. When he did get out, he looked older than he had the last time she had seen him, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, which was also unusual, and he said her name properly for the first time, not Connie, but Constance. And she understood that this was the vocabulary of a man who has arrived at something it cost him to arrive at. He said he had heard her spring had held. She said it had. He said he wanted to know if there was any arrangement possible for his cows to water from the spring, temporarily, while his pond recovered, and that he would compensate her fairly for the access and for any interference with her operation. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Bring them down the East Lane on Tuesday morning. There is room along the bank below the channel inlet. Keep them below the inlet." He said, "What do I owe you?" She said, "Fix the East Lane gate in spring. The hinge is gone." He stood with his hat in his hands, and she could see that what he was feeling was not simple gratitude, but the compound and harder emotion of a man who has been wrong in a way he cannot blame on bad luck or unusual circumstances, who has been wrong because he was certain, and who now must arrange his understanding of himself around that fact. She did not help him with this. It was his work to do. He said, "I told you this was a museum." She said, "You did." He said, "I was wrong about that." She said, "I know. Tuesday morning, East Lane." He nodded and got back in the truck and drove away. She went inside and wrote the date in her notebook, not the date of the drought or the date of his loss, but the date of the watering arrangement, which she noted with the same precision she gave every other entry: date, terms, and one-line observation. The observation for that entry read, "The spring does not care who needs it." Over the following 3 weeks, 8 other farms sent animals or barrels or both down the East Lane. Constance and Ruth managed the access with a schedule written in pencil on a card tacked to the barn door, and the spring ran at 51 degrees and adequate volume through all of it, because limestone aquifers work on a time scale that has no interest in one summer's accounting. The cultured cream operation did not stop during the drought weeks. The jars went out on the usual days at the usual modest price, the same price they had been charging since the first 6 jars 2 years before. 2 of the drought-era customers, arriving with dried mud trucks and the particular exhaustion of people who have been solving urgent problems for months, asked Constance how the product had not been interrupted when every other dairy in the county was struggling. She explained the spring. She explained the copper. She explained in brief and factual terms the temperature curve. One of the 2, a younger woman named Dina Marsh, who kept a small herd on the county's southern edge and who had been through her own equipment losses that summer, asked if Constance would be willing to go over the method with her in more detail. Constance said she would. They arranged a time. This was how the teaching began. It was not a school. It was 2 or 3 women at a time sitting in the barn with Gerald's notebooks and the grandmother's volume open on the workbench and the collie watching from wherever it had chosen to settle that morning, and Constance going through the numbers and the principles and the method with the directness of someone who has verified each piece personally. Ruth taught the separator calibration. Constance taught the temperature reading and the copper assessment and the spring flow calculations. She made copies by hand of the grandmother's key entries and of Gerald's water temperature tables, because the originals were irreplaceable and because the knowledge belonged to anyone willing to learn it carefully. By the winter of '54, 3 farms in the county had installed their own spring-fed copper systems, 2 of them using equipment purchased from the same dispersal sales Constance had been mining for 3 years. The co-op agent who came to one of those farms to review the setup paused at the limestone-lined channel and said it reminded him of something. The farmer, who was Dina Marsh, said, "It should. It comes from Constance Vane. Harold Fetzer retired in '58. At the retirement supper the county organized for him, he made a speech that covered his career's accomplishments at length and then, at the end, added a paragraph that everyone who was there remembered, though they remembered it differently depending on where they had stood in the story. He said that in his years as extension agent he had given a good deal of advice that had been right and some that had been wrong, and that the cases he thought about most were not the complicated ones, but the simple ones where he had been wrong because he had trusted the current guidance over the knowledge of someone who had done the actual work of understanding. He did not say Constance Vane's name. Everyone in the room knew whose name he meant. Constance was not at the supper. She was at the farm, as she generally was in the evenings. Ruth was there. The collie had died in '56, and they had a younger dog now who was still learning the rhythms of the barn. The current batch was in the cooler tanks at 51 degrees. The spring ran as it always had, without any interest in the season or the occasion, or the question of who deserved credit for what. The jars went out on the usual days. The notebook entries continued, dated and precise. She kept working until she was 67, at which point her hands made the wire brush work difficult, and she moved from the physical production to the teaching exclusively, which she conducted 3 mornings a week in a room she had cleared in the barn's upper level with a long table and the workbench and the notebooks and the grandmother's volume in a slipcase she had made from the leather of Gerald's old field bag. She charged $4 for the course, which covered the cost of the printed reference sheets she prepared from the notebooks each term. She had been offered more. She charged $4. Ruth ran the production. Ruth's daughter, who had grown up hearing the work discussed at the dinner table and who had her mother's eye for calibration and her father's patience with numbers, joined the operation in '69 and brought with her a set of questions about scaling the method that Constance answered carefully and completely, including the questions whose answers she did not fully know, in which case she said she did not fully know, and here was what the data suggested, and here was where more observation was needed. This was not a style of answer that everyone who came to her with questions had expected, but it was the accurate one. Constance Vane died in the spring of 1979 at the age of 70, which is to say she had 27 years from the moment she first drove the flatbed to the Pruitt farm sale, and came home with 6 rusted cream cans and a plan that everyone agreed was the wrong response to grief. She had filled 41 notebooks of her own by then, kept in the same format as Gerald's, dated and numbered, with a single line of observation at the end of each entry that was never decorative and never vague. The last entry in the last notebook is dated 3 days before she died, and it reads, "Spring running strong, water 51, batch 47 on track, Ruth has it." The operation ran for another 19 years under Ruth's hand and Ruth's daughters. It was the subject of a study published in '62 in an agricultural journal out of the State University, which cited the water temperature consistency and the copper surface dynamics as a model for low-infrastructure artisan dairy production, and which led to a small and permanent increase in the price people were willing to pay for the jars. Though the price charged did not change by that much, the barn still stands. The limestone channel still carries the spring water through it at 51 degrees in every season, because the aquifer below it works on a scale that has no particular opinion about who is watching. There is a marker at the lane gate. It is not large. It is a flat piece of local limestone with letters cut into it by a mason who knew the family, and it was placed there by Ruth's daughter in 1991 when she closed the commercial operation and donated the notebooks to the County Historical Archive. The letters say, "She read what was already there. That is all. It is enough." The older residents who remember being young when the flatbed came home with the rusted cream cans, who remember standing in the yard or by the road or at the co-op and agreeing that the widow was spending her grief money wrong, have mostly made their peace with the story, each in the way that suits them. The ones who remember it most honestly say what honest people say when they have been confidently wrong about someone patient, that they should have asked more questions and offered fewer answers. The ones who say it most plainly are the ones who have since learned something from the ground up and discovered how long that kind of learning takes and how little it resembles the certainty they used to carry. The spring still runs. The temperature is still 51. The notebooks are in the archive and anyone can read them, which is the point, which was always the point, which is the only thing Constance Vane ever asked of anyone, that they read carefully and take the time to understand what was already there.